All right, welcome everybody. We can get started, I think, and we've got a little bit of a spiel up front before we dive into the content. So we'll just let folks trickle in here. As I'm seeing everybody's name roll by, I'm realizing it's been a handful of months since I saw you last. And so I just want to reintroduce myself. I'm Lauren Foster, and I'll be facilitating these meetings. And so I'm just really grateful to be here with you all and excited to show you what the project team has been up to. And I'm going to start by passing it over to David Sowers for a little introduction.
All right, well, thanks, Lauren. Again, I'm David Sowers. I'm the Director of Terminal Engineering for Washington State Ferries and know many of you, and thank you for being here today and spending a little time with us as we deal with this project. We appreciate your patience while we have been working on this and pulling together information that we're going to share with you today. We sent you some information on alternatives, and those include the Fauntleroy area and then some other locations the other day, and then along with some revised final purpose and need statements. We did meet with our community advisory group last week, and we received some good feedback from them on the screening process that we're using, and we'll share some updates on that process a little bit later today. I also want to welcome community members that are joining us and in attendance who are not part of the technical advisory group. And for those of you attending in the audience, you'll be able to use the chat today. But as you listen, if you have any comments or questions or other thoughts about this process that you want to share, we invite you to submit those to the project inbox. And there we will log each and all of those into our public comment log. And then we share that with all the advisory groups ahead of these meetings. So that's just a little bit of an overview. I'm going to turn it back to Lauren for the rest of the agenda.
Great, thank you. So everyone, just a reminder that these meetings are being recorded and will be posted to the project website for anybody who can't attend live. And I just really quickly will reiterate a few technical details to make sure everyone is settled and able to participate fully. So as Dave mentioned, the members of the public who are in attendance today will be in listen only mode, but TAG members will have the option to turn your cameras on, unmute, and use the chat. Please just make sure your name is showing up correctly by selecting rename. Remember to keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking and unmute yourself when you are. And you're welcome to turn your camera on, but if you don't feel like doing that, then no worries about that. So during the discussion periods, we'll be using chat and the raise hand tools for participation to organize those pieces. And you should see the chat at the bottom of your window. And we want to make sure that that's working for all of you. So please pull up the chat box, select everyone in who you're sending it to. And then please share your name, the agency you represent, and one thing that you enjoy about spring. All right, we've got a few more people joining us right now, so I'll just say again what we're doing. Just in the chat, please share your name, the agency you're representing, and something that you enjoy about spring. Looks like Benjamin is getting his hands dirty. Everybody loves the flowers and the sun is such a welcome presence. It's out today. Ooh, bird migration. Yeah. Mark's going to get out there hiking. The flowers. It took our daffodils so long to open, but they're finally there. Yes. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Please keep putting those in if you haven't yet. And just make sure that you're able to see those answers to make sure your chat box is working, and raise your hand if you can't. And again, members of the public will see the chat messages that TAG members select only when they're sent to everyone. So please use that feature, send to everyone unless you're chatting to a specific person. All right, we can go into the agenda. So today you're going to hear just a little bit more from me and Dave, and then you'll hear from our consultant team's transportation lead, Mark Bandy, and our environmental lead, Marcia Tolan. And my colleagues, Laura Lobisinger Miller and Haley Nolan, are here to help run the meeting along with our technical specialist, Scott Burns. So you can chat to any one of us if you're having difficulties with anything. And we're gonna start today by reviewing the draft alternatives that we sent you yesterday morning, including some of the alternative locations that the community has suggested over the past few years and the alternatives at Fauntleroy. And finally, we're gonna share some updates to our screening approach and revised screening criteria. And then we'll talk about what comes next. So before we dive into our agenda, I want to acknowledge that we sent out the updated public comment log for your review ahead of this meeting. We have received a lot of comments over the past few weeks as these alternatives and screening materials have been shared with the community, both through the community advisory group and local media. And we share this to make sure that these conversations are informed by feedback from the broader community to stay accountable to tracking, considering, and responding to every comment that comes to us. So there's a number of themes that are coming through that you'll see on the screen. And we want to just give you a moment to ask any questions that you might have about the comment log, or comments or thoughts on anything that we've heard lately. Go ahead and raise your hand or enter in the chat if you have any comments or questions. All right. Well, if you do get a chance to look into those more deeply and you have comments or questions, feel free to send them to our project inbox, and we'll make sure that becomes a part of the conversation. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dave to talk about kind of where we are in this process and get us started looking through the materials.
All right. Well, thanks, Lauren. So we still are in the early stages of the Pell process. I'll just set the stage for that. We are in this developing screening criteria and alternatives phase, and we expect to be able to run the screening and bring results back to this group and to the community this spring. So we're continuing to march along in that path. These results will give us information to eliminate any alternatives that don't meet the purpose and need, and as well as to add detail and refinement for the next round of screening, which we'll get into in more detail here. We've heard strongly from the community advisory group in our meeting last week and another feedback they've given us of their interest in diving into a deeper level of analysis and a more focused set of alternatives. And up until now, we've been taking a more methodical approach to making sure we're considering all options and all of the feedback we've got over the years. So little shift in kind of what we heard the other day. Today, we will look at the draft alternatives and including suggestions that we received to relocate the terminal, which was something that was on the table, and options as well at Fauntleroy. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the screening process and then what we have planned to go into that next step. As I said, we've heard from the community over the past several years, the desire to look at alternate locations in Fauntleroy. So I want to turn this over to Mark Bandy. He's going to talk a little bit more about those other locations that were suggested, including locations in Elliott Bay, of course, the Fauntleroy area, and then locations that were proposed down in Burien or in Des Moines. So with that, Mark, take it away.
All right, thanks, David. And I'm getting a bit of a, I was getting an echo. I think I'm okay now, so sorry about that. So Dave just highlighted the some of the areas outside of the Fauntleroy area where there had been suggestions of possibly moving the ferry terminal. So they're shown on the map here. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll show you some of the analysis we did to kind of show how that might affect ferry service. So I'll walk through this graphic, a bit of information on it, and orient you to it. On the left, we have the areas and then the ferry travel time that would go across the water from point to point. And then using that information and then dwell time, we can, with a 3-boat system, it's a pretty fundamental assumption that goes into this, because that's consistent with the long range plan for WSF, is that there would be 3 Issaquah class ferries serving the route. Many of you, I'm sure, are going to be familiar with frequencies and headways and that kind of stuff. And that's the information that's in the upper right there by area. And so if you start with Fauntleroy, we were comparing it to the Fauntleroy area, and you can see the information there about the distance and then how many peak period and daily departures occur with the current system, as well as the time between departures. And then if you go over to the North Elliott Bay area, you'll see how that's a longer distance, and therefore there would be a reduction in the number of departures from 8 to 5 in the peak period, or 38 to 23. And you can see similar information for Des Moines and Burien. And we shared this with the CAG, the Community Advisory Group, and pretty strongly across the group heard that this information was sufficient to say that we should just focus on the Fauntleroy area for the terminal location. There were a few members who expressed a desire for some additional information to kind of screen through and document this. And so we'll be working on that. And later in the presentation, there'll be some information that Marshall will share to kind of show you some of the additional information we'll bring to us. I think with that, I think our next step is to go into a discussion about this and see if that information from you all is sufficient.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So we're interested in hearing from you if that approach makes sense to you, and if there are any questions or comments you have about the alternate locations that we were considering that we brought to the Community Advisory Group, or any questions about that group's feedback. And I see one question from David Forte about what are the major origin and destinations on the east side relative to possible terminal sites. Do you want to take that, Mark?
Sure. Hi, David. Good to see you again. Based on an older O&D study, origin destination study, it showed that about 40% of the trips for Fauntleroy were going to downtown Seattle and points north. About 30% or so were staying or going into the West Seattle, SoDo general area. And then the remaining 30% were scattered in pretty far destinations around to, the east side or further south to south of Seattle.
Thank you. So there isn't really one or two or three even primary kind of routes. David, did you have any follow-up questions or anything that you wanted to, anything more you wanted to know?
No, thanks. It was just questions about it. If you're thinking about moving to terminal, does it suit most people that are using the terminal on the east side? Going through just those questions relative.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions about, Mark, do you want to go, or Laura, do you want to go back one slide so that folks can just look at that map a little bit more and see if there's anything that they have questions about? So again, to summarize kind of what Mark was saying, the CAG really suggested kind of, yes, we can probably move forward with just alternatives at Fauntleroy, but wanting to see a little bit more of our work, a little more justification for not moving forward with any other locations. There's a hand from Penny. Penny, go ahead.
I don't actually take the ferries, so I have to admit that my questions might seem like lacking in some way. So I just want to put that caveat out there. But I'm just curious, that some of these commute time seems like that would be one of the number one criteria, except for the one that's really close. So you have like the 25 and 20 minute and the 40 minutes and 30 minutes. But I was wondering if there was any kind of comparison that says, even if there was a longer commute time, another location would allow more efficient loading. Because I noticed a lot of the comments, at least what I was able to get through from the community group, advisory group, was really focusing in on how to process cars and the ticketing. And that seemed like that was a really very useful thing, just addressing so many other things, and especially with the limitation of infrastructure at any given place. So I just looked at these and was like, why would they even go somewhere where the commute would be longer? I would think that commuters would have some frustration with that. I don't know if that question makes sense, but I was kind of wondering if longer commute times in a different location lent itself better to faster processing time.
Sure, thanks. I'll start by saying I think this sort of question is part of the reason the CAG wanted to see a little more justification, even though it kind of seems clear that the longer commute times would reduce the level of service. Just wanting to hear a little bit more about how that works out, but I'll ask Mark if you have any other comments about that.
Sure. I'll touch on a couple things. So one thing to note here that obviously comes with ferry service, before I get to the processing time, is just it's also the frequency is an important consideration, because the longer a route is, then there's fewer sailings, right? So you have to factor that in or consider that as, how much wait time do you need. With respect to processing, generally the variation that's going to happen with a loading and unloading of a ferry is, you can see it at the bottom there. The dwell time is, that's what the dwell time is, and it's generally in a 15 to 20 minute range. And so when you're talking about efficiency applications, which you would have heard about fare processing and others, really relates to, it's kind of like taking minutes off of that 15 to 20 range. So that's probably the order of magnitude that you're looking at, and it really kind of also helps with reliability of maintaining the sailing time. So it's not, I guess the point there, Penny, is it's not going to be that different amongst different locations to where it's going to make up for the different sailing times that you see on this graphic, or allow an additional sailing, for example, in the peak period, given these distances and timeframes.
Okay, cool. Thank you for explaining that.
Thank you. And I think when we get to the screening criteria as well, you'll get a sense of kind of what all we'll be looking at as we develop some preliminary information about the alternatives that might get at some of that. I see a question from Benjamin. Oh, go ahead.
So this is Mark. I was just going to ask if Dave wanted to add anything to what I said. Or...
No, I think you covered it well, Mark. I think maybe for Penny's benefit, I mean, the other thing that I want to point out is that there are peak times, peak periods where this processing efficiency sort of starts to degrade a little bit. But the other 20 hours a day that we're operating, you'd still be on these same turnaround times, and there's a lot less efficiency when the terminal isn't full. So it's not just to add a little bit to what Mark said. It also depends on the time of day and how many folks we're processing for a particular sailing that affects our efficiencies in loading and unloading.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question from Benjamin over at SDOT asking, are there potential new terminal sites on the east side of Vashon Island that could or would be closer to the Burien or Des Moines terminal area, and whether or not that's pushing the bounds of what's conceivable for this process, 2 new terminals rather than 1. And we did get a comment in the comment log, something to that effect as well. So Dave, I'll pass that over to you, I think, to answer.
Yeah, that's certainly that's a creative idea and something that we have not looked at. It wasn't in the scope of work to deal with the west side of the route, but just the Fauntleroy side. So yeah, as you can imagine, Benjamin, that would double the scope of work. And after all the investments we've made at the Vashon terminal recently, that would, those we'd have to kind of throw those out and start from scratch. So it's not something that's on the table right now. But again, as we've said before, we are looking at terminals possibilities in Burien and Des Moines as part of this study, and that's certainly would certainly make the travel time and the crossing times much more reasonable, but it would force us to build a second terminal.
Thank you. I see John LeCompte has his hand up. You want to go ahead, John?
John, you're on mute. No, you're still on
Sorry,
mute.
is it not coming through my phone?
Oh,
no,
now
no.
it's coming. Thank you. Oh, and now it's off again. We had you for a moment.
How about now?
Now we have you. Yes, go for it.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, thanks.
I'm coming from two different perspectives here. One is from the utility side as the electrification plans go forward of the fleet and charging at terminals. And as well, I grew up on Fauntleroy, and my dad was a chief engineer on one of the ferries, so I spent a fair bit of time as a kid in the terminals, in the engine rooms. Don't tell anyone. But also observing traffic on Fauntleroy. And it seems to me that the solutions that include expanding the holding capacity on the trestle would improve things as far as the ticketing and loading times, which would result in greater schedule reliability, greater predictability of dwell times, and then the associated on-time performance. And then it also, it makes it a little more challenging for the utility, because if the dwell times are shorter, then that means more power needed, basically quicker charging. But nonetheless, it seems like that, saves a lot of the trouble, because I'm about a mile, between 1 and 2 miles up, and sometimes the traffic will back up past our house. And then it interferes with parking for people who are enjoying Lincoln Park. So anyway, those are my thoughts. They're all kind of interrelated, but wanted to throw them out there.
Yeah, thank you. And when we move past this comparison of the potential locations, we'll dig into some of the alternatives at Fauntleroy that would address that lineup and some of the traffic, and then in the criteria, what we'll be looking at when we run those through the screening.
Yeah, Lauren, I'll just add
Go ahead.
that's why this is called the technical advisory group, because we've got electrical engineers here thinking about stuff that nobody else is thinking about. And I think what I heard from John is that he's the one advocate out there for us to be a little less efficient processing terminals, so the boats can get a full charge from City Lights feed. So that's great. But that's, all kidding aside, that's certainly something that's important for us to think about as we charge these boats. And I think where John's going is we need to have the infrastructure on the dock to charge the vessels, and that's another space requirement that we have to think about as we get into design. So yeah, thanks, John, for your feedback.
Thank you. And I see you have to jump off. So if you're able to watch a recording of the rest of this meeting, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the coming days. Sharon, you've had your hand up for a while. Thanks for your patience.
No problem. I just, as we're looking at these travel times on the water as, am I correct? That's just the water crossing time? Okay, I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, would it be possible, I'm looking at this area and the drive time, you know, I'm wondering if it would be possible to have like a couple of points on the map and say, what would the total trip from that point to Vashon be? You know, if you figured in the extra drive to the other locations. I don't know if that's reasonable or just too, I know it would depend on time of day and everything, but it seems like if you were really gonna seriously look at moving the terminal, it seems like we're missing a big chunk of the trip depending on where you start. I'm kind of going back to David's question about the, you know, OD studies, you know, where are you starting from essentially? And it feels like you don't just get plunked down at one of the ferry terminals, you're starting from somewhere else, going to a terminal on the way. Just wondering if that's factored in at all.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for asking that. We had very similar questions from the community advisory group. And I think our project team members can speak to this in detail, but I'll just preface that generally the origin and destination information that we have doesn't really show that there are just one or two or three destinations where people are going. There's 40% of the traffic heading to downtown Seattle or points north, and then the rest of the 60% is headed all sorts of places, and some of the trips even end in West Seattle. And so we have, you know, thought about it and looked at that data, and we're just not sure it provides information to really screen the alternatives with. But I'll ask if Mark or Marcia would like to speak any more to that point, or correct me if I've said something wrong.
No, you said it great, Lauren. I think the thing I'll just remind, in addition, add to that is just remember the frequency is a big portion of it. So for example, again, looking at a location, an alternate terminal that might be closer to where some destinations are, clearly is going to be further than the others. But you're really, when you're looking at how, you know, how many times can you get that sailing, then that is a big part of it's not just your travel time, it's how frequently you can access essentially the system here.
Thanks, Sharon. How does that
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not advocating for, you know, that one of them is really a better solution, but it just seems like they're yeah, again, it does depend on where you're starting. But I think that makes sense. It just seemed like a missing piece, but I understand what you're saying, that there isn't one answer. I just didn't know, there might be some representative ones, but again, this is also, I know, something that, you know, if we had to move this terminal, you know, it would be maybe a more worth more investigation into it, but it just seems like a missing piece. But again, I hear you that there's so many permutations that it might not make sense to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, and Mark can jump in too here if you like, the idea again is that we will include the alternate locations in the screening so that we get more information to see if they're, you know, worth pursuing further and getting that sort of level of information, or what else we would need to know about that. But the presumption at this point, and what we heard from the CAG, is that it should be reasonable to move forward with alternatives at Fauntleroy, but we just want to make sure that we have additional information to make sure that that's a sound decision. Any other comments from project team members that I haven't called on, or questions from the TAG members before we move on to the other alternatives in the Fauntleroy area? Okay. Well, thanks so much for your questions and feedback on this so far. And if you have a chance to spend more time with it, please feel free to send an email or even bring it up later in this meeting if you like. I'm going to pass it back over to Mark, who's going to walk us through the alternatives for replacing the terminal in the Fauntleroy area.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Just waiting for the
Sorry, I'm
slides
having some
to advance.
technical troubles with the slideshow. So go ahead and get started, Mark, and I'll share again.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll stretch out my words just a bit because it's talking about a concept without the graphic is I'm not that descriptive, I suppose. So yeah. So what I'm about to show you, or we're going to go through, is as Lauren said, we've drafted up some alternatives that are in the Fauntleroy area. That many of these were the initial basis was a community suggestion over the years. So I'm going to first talk about the building blocks that you'll see in the subsequent graphics. So there'll be a description of what the dock or terminal has. So how much holding is on the dock, which kind of sort of the size of it, obviously. One thing to say at the beginning is that we're trying to, in each of these, have a total of 186 vehicle holding area in either combination of the dock and the shoulder of the street approaching it, or on the dock entirely. So various permutations there. And then you'll see how we call out if there's shoulder area holding. You see in the kind of center of the graphic there. That'll be how it's shown. And obviously, if the dock size changes, then the amount of holding that's needed on the street can be different. And then also possibly with some of the added considerations that are called out in the lower left, adding good to go or making that part of the terminal design, or other advanced payment systems, or even overhead loading can also change how much the holding area is needed. So let's walk through the different examples. So the first one, which we've labeled alternative A, is to replace the dock in the same size. And so as it is today, and it would, of course, be seismically and structurally replaced. And the one thing I'll note on the supplemental considerations, we were talking about them as supplemental. One thing we heard very strongly from the community advisory groups was that they want to see alternatives with these aspects built into them. And so that'll be something as we go forward with these that we'll be updating the alternatives. But this is basically replace the dock in kind as it is. And you can see the holding area being very similar to today. I think I saw a chat question come through from Ben that I'll touch on right now, which is, where did the 186 come from? So basically, there's a design standard for WSF to have holding for 1.5 times the vessel size. And so with the service on this route being 124 vehicle Issaquah class ferries, 1.5 times that is 186. And just for comparison purposes, today the dock has room for about 80 vehicles on the dock. And then Fauntleroy itself, if you go all the way up to 47th Avenue and the gas station, that's like my notes, it's on the order of 226 vehicles of holding. So is what's out there today, if you total it all up. Let's go to the next alternative. So alternative B is expand the dock at the current location. And so this is expanding the dock to hold 124 vehicles, which you would have just heard me say is the size of the vessel. So this would hold one ferry's worth of vehicles on the dock. And then to get the 186 total, there's a smaller or shorter amount of holding that's on Fauntleroy itself. And again, these alternatives can be paired with, and will be paired subsequently with, good to go and other things like that. Alternative C is to further expand the dock to have 186 vehicles entirely on the dock. And so in this case, you see that there's no shoulder holding lane on Fauntleroy under this alternative. And you see in the graphic there, I forgot to mention this on the previous one, but the dimensions, approximate dimensions of how much the dock size would need to change to accommodate the increased size. In this case, it's approximately 60 feet, could be up to 60 feet wider. And the previous one, I want to say it was, maybe you can flip back for a second, Laura, so make sure I call it the dimension correctly. Yeah, so in this case, the 124, we showed it being extended, the dock being extended further into the water on the order of 220 feet. All right, let's go back. So that's the 186. So let's go to the next alternative. So now we're showing something that, again, has been suggested in previous public comments. This is showing a dock location that's at the southerly end of Lincoln Park. We're showing this for representation purposes. If we put something there, just showing an alternative that is a 186 vehicle size dock. See, some of the considerations that would come with advancing this alternative is the access road between Fauntleroy and the dock, and the, you know, what comes with that, and also, you know, park properties and some things like that that'll be part of those additional considerations as we criteria that we screen these against. Go to the next slide. Another alternative location in Fauntleroy is at Loman Beach. This was suggested, and similar size dock as we just showed for South Lincoln Park, and has some of the similar issues and considerations that have to be further investigated. Again, access road and distance from Fauntleroy Way, where the transit service currently sits, are all considerations, as well as it being a park property nearby. Okay, alternative F. Now these next couple are going to be, I'll call them landside alternatives to kind of address the holding and impacts of ferry holding. So this alternative F is a suggestion of doing 2 lanes on Fauntleroy Way for holding. And obviously Fauntleroy Way itself, if you don't know, is only 3 lanes in width. So if you take 2 of them for holding, that only leaves 1 lane for other purposes. So the implication is you'd have to look at converting Fauntleroy Way to 1 way. And this is basically paired with a same size dock as today. Go to the next alternative. So alternative G is a suggestion that we've drawn up here, which is to allow ferry traffic to approach the current terminal location from either direction. So either coming from the north or from the south, and splitting the holding on approach. And I think this is in one way also trying to get to being able to designate one of those holding areas for a different destination. We'll go to the next alternative. Okay, so alternative H, this is a concept, again, paired with the current dock size of doing remote holding. So the idea here is to, you know, identify a property or parcel that is up further away from the terminal, so that you could basically hold vehicles there until it's time to basically have them go down to the dock to load the ferry. And so the idea here is to again, reduce how much holding is happening on Fauntleroy Way itself. And again, we're showing this one with the current dock size of 80. And so the size of the holding area remotely identified is the 106 vehicle difference. I'm gonna go to the next one. And then this is another variation of the remote holding that, again, someone had suggested in past public comments, is to use the parking lot that's at Lincoln Park for the remote holding area. Again, it would come with some considerations and discussion about the use of that property for that purpose, and whether that's viable and beneficial.
All right, thank you, Mark.
Mhm.
It looks like we've already got some feedback coming in the chat, which is great. It sounds like the alternatives for Loman Beach and Lincoln Park aren't great for transit connectivity, and the alternative F holding lane option would not work for rapid ride. So that's really important to note for us. Thank you. And I know David Forte has been waiting patiently with your hand up.
Thanks. The E's silent, by the way.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
It's all right. Question on, could you remind me again, I don't concentrate on this route a lot, but the operational constraints that you have on your loading, because it is the triangle. So when you have, a can you load a full bolt? I mean, you have to have a split loads? How does that impact the ability? Because what I'm thinking is any of the options outside of the dock, you have to be, it's a mixed lane. So if you have different, going to Fauntleroy or going to Vashon or going to Southworth or going to Vashon, do they have to be separated out? So just some characteristics of how the loading constraints operate. And it sounds like you don't have enough on dock to do one full load. So you actually have to do the ticket processing to fill the boat. So just could you give me a quick rundown on the operational?
Go ahead, Mark.
Sure, and I'm going to ask probably Dave to kind of help support this, or Hadley. So let me touch on the processing. I'll come in reverse order. So David and others, yeah, that's why there's a strong interest in what ways are there available to speed up the fare processing effort, and Good to Go may be one of those. We're going to consider Good to Go and look at how that could potentially reduce fare processing time, because just anything that is above that basically is not on dock, that's not a full boat's worth, there's a relationship to getting through the fare toll booths today. So other ideas that have come up to maybe try and help with that is if you did an advanced ticketing or a reservation system that, again, is similar of basically doing an advanced ticketing. With respect to the basically the sorting and the loading, ferries' staff, they've got a process down where they can basically fill the boat with, when it's a dual destination boat, which is I think the majority of the sailings now. But Dave or Hadley, do you want to talk about what that process looks like?
Well, Leonard Smith's on this call too.
Yeah, I was supposed to say.
Leonard.
Okay. Well, Leonard would be the person to speak to it then.
Yeah, I was going to say, Leonard, we can put you on the spot, but while you're getting ready, Leonard, David, you've hit on I think you articulated it yourself well, the challenges of this terminal, that you have fewer cars inside the toll booths than would fill a boat. So you are processing cars. And we went through a whole process with the community prior to starting this project to rewrite the sailing schedule to sort of make the best use of the facility as we could. And one of our community advisory group members came up with this idea of making as many trips as possible dual destination, for that reason that you're not needing to sort between the destinations as you're selling tickets, as you're loading the boats and pulling people out of line. And it was kind of pretty complicated before we made most of the sailings dual destination. There are still some that are single destination, and there's some concern from the Southworth and Vashon communities that dual destination requires the Southworth customers to travel through Vashon to get to their destination, which adds 10 to 15 minutes to their trip. So it's not a resolved issue, and it is operationally challenging. And I'll let Leonard explain a little more about how they load, if you're able to, Leonard.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. I think you guys actually touched on most of it. The big change was being able to take both destinations on a single departure. So that definitely helped the processing. I mean, prior to that, we actually had to sort prior to the toll booth to get the appropriate destination on the dock and onto that particular sailing. So the taking both destinations on the single departure helped a lot. But you're right, with 80 cars of holding, I mean, we are processing the end of the load through the toll booths. So that is an impact, and Mark suggested some other ideas to be able to improve that in the future. So, David, what did I miss? I was trying to capture your questions and see if everybody kind of got to your answers needed.
Oh, no, good. That's good, because it was the question, because it really impacts any off-site designs. If you have to segregate, if you have to hold. And also, you know, as Leonard knows, I've been doing a lot of work up in Kingston. And the possibilities of how you could use active traffic management systems like we're considering up there to monitor and control the flow of traffic and reduce the impacts to certain areas. But that, with the separation, needing to separate, you know, always has that question, how do you work with that? So I just wanted to bring up those types of questions and also just remind myself what's happening here.
Great.
Thank you. Chris Arkills?
Hi. I had a question and some comments on transit, a little finer point on some of the things I put in the chat. I'm wondering if any of the Lincoln Park options for either parking or for a terminal are even realistic under federal 4F laws, because you clearly have other alternatives, and you can only build in a park if you don't have alternatives. And, you know, I just want to say some of those, a lot of those other options simply don't work for transit. To put a finer point on what the transit situation is now. Currently, the dock enjoys access to the Rapid Ride C line every 7 to 15 minutes, pretty much all day, well into the night, which makes it a very attractive pair. It's a relatively short walk to the transit stop. Any of those other options, you know, D, you might make a much longer walk. E, we can't even serve Longman Beach with buses. There's currently no bus that goes down there. And the only place a bus can go north from there is Beach Drive and all the way around Alki. And that is not going to be an attractive transit option. So any of those options that move us away from the dock are going to be bad for that bus ferry interface. So just wanted to make that clear to everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for elaborating a little bit. That's really important for the analysis to know. And when we get to the screening criteria, I think you'll see that. And we've heard, you know, from the community and in the comment log that transit connectivity is very important to the community. So I appreciate your comments on that. Does anybody on the project team want to respond to that at all before I move on?
I was going to joke with Chris that we would just put some gondolas up and we could run people to the Fauntleroy Way that way. But no, that's a great point, Chris. And the reason we're having these conversations with you all and getting the technical perspective is because we want to take that back and share it with the community, and it'll help us, you know, solidify these alternatives and what works and what doesn't work. And you know, like John said earlier, there's going to be all these different sort of ways of looking at it, and I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Those are all great points. So we'll stop thinking about gondolas.
And this is Marcia Tolan. Yes, Chris, we do understand that Section 4F and would be a hurdle for some of these alternatives. So thanks for noting it.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of information that that is very helpful right now. I will hop back to the chat really quickly before going to the raised hands. Benjamin Smith asked if we are looking at a mix and match approach, depending on the size of the dock and those potential holding alternatives. And I think alternatives E, F, and G. Oh, sorry, F, G, and H. Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, the answer, Ben, is that, you know, as we go further into what alternatives continue to advance and we do evaluation on them, you know, if we need to bring, excuse me, bring an element into that mixing matching scenario, we definitely would do that. And you know, I think one of the reasons we were showing you this range was to show basically, as the range, the word range implies, we're intending like to say like this is a mix and match. So if there's a particular pairing of something that you don't see and you think we need to be thinking about, that's one of the things we want to hear from you at this point.
Thanks. Benjamin, did you have any thoughts on any pairings that you would want to see?
Not as yet. I was just kind of asking if that was something that sounds like it could happen later on. Thanks.
Thanks. And let's see, David Graves, you've had your hand up.
Hi, all. David Graves, Seattle Parks and Recreation. Oops, let me lower my hand too. Yeah, I just want to reiterate kind of the 4F concerns for particularly for Loman and for impacts at Lincoln. And just so you all know, we're just wrapping up a big shoreline restoration project at Loman funded by Surfboard and some other state grants. So there's a significant amount of protections that come with these grants as far as preserving those in perpetuity for park and recreation and restoration uses. So there's some significant hurdles to overcome. I mean, besides the whole transit integration piece, definitely for Loman and probably similar concerns related to Lincoln Park too. So those are, I just want to make sure that folks kind of were aware of what's going on kind of on the land and the underlying grant protections that go with those parks beyond the federal legislation.
Yes, thank you so much. And I also see Jessica Olmsted saying that the existing DNR aquatic lands easement would only be effective to authorize the current terminal location. So there's definitely multiple considerations in terms of permitting and legal. Marcia, do you want to respond to anything about that?
Yes, as David mentioned, if we got Surfboard funding for the shoreline restoration at Loman Park, that's the kind of, it's like a deed restriction. And so similar to 4F, but with a bit more parameters to it. It's like what section 6F, the same, it carries the same weight to it and would be much more of a hurdle also to work with. And so we understand that as well as the 4F concerns. And yes, and with Jessica, the DNR easement at Fauntleroy is real. And if we had to look at any other location, we would have to entertain that process with is it the Harbors Committee that we have to work with? I'm sure you would enlighten us on the whole steps of that it would take, but that also is another one that impacts with time and funding into the project.
Thank you.
Lauren, I just wanted to point out, because we skipped over the alternate locations graphic earlier for David's sake, that some of the community suggestions we've heard for those alternate locations up in Elliott Bay are also parklands. So I think that's part of the conversation we'll need to have when we talk about those, that Seacrest Park and the Ports, Jack Block Park and others have been mentioned as other locations that are in that green shaded area up in Elliott Bay. And I think that those conversations are relative to those properties as well. Just so it's on your radar, David, if you see comments related to Seacrest Park and others up there.
Thanks, Hadley. Penny, go ahead.
I was just noticing with the alternatives, especially I think it was B and C, wondering also if, let's see, I'm trying to focus on lowering my hand. I don't want to forget that. Just if also at this stage, because in these early stages, sometimes some of the things that I would look at are not really on the radar screen as ecology and under 401 kind of stuff. But just wondering if the habitat is being looked at as well. I know these are more developed areas, but you also have parks. And so the fact is, I noticed between like B and C, there was one that went out longer and there was one that was like wider. And it seems like some of the things that I've seen, especially working on other kinds of projects, where they look at the near shore versus being out in deeper water. And so I didn't know if that was taken into consideration at all when looking at some of these alternatives.
Thank you, Penny. You're right that early on in this process, the level of detail that we're looking at is less, particularly since there's the NEPA process that comes after the Pell process. But I will send it over to Marcia to talk about how that might get incorporated at this stage.
Yeah, at this stage, it's very much conceptual. We have this conceptual footprint, and some of our criteria also that we'll talk about in a few minutes take on the perspective of, is it possible to permit, and will permitting the timeline it takes for that to occur, and also to meet some of the approvals. So under that umbrella, we are accounting for some of the habitat issues, and as you mentioned, near shore. But as our engineers, as they were looking at some of these conceptual ideas and thinking about the main points within our purpose and need statement of operations and safety and structural reliability and resilience, that if you extend it out there, it may create it will create some different issues than it is to make it wider on the nearshore habitat. And so defining some of those distinctions between what it does to the habitat would be part of the next level of refinement of the alternatives and the screening. But at this level, we look at just generally, do we think that that's permittable? Does that help, Penny?
Yeah, I think so. I know that if you're looking at permittable, that means to me you would at least be also looking for anything that would be a red flag where you would get feedback that says, no, that's not happening. But I've been, again, not familiar with these shorelines very well, but just noting that you've got a lot of development. And so I'm guessing there's not a lot of this is an absolute no-go, but not as familiar with it. So yeah, that's just something that I was wondering how that was being addressed. So thanks, Marcia.
Yeah, thank you, Penny.
Thank you, Penny. I'm going to direct us back to the chat for a minute in between a sprinkling of interest in the gondola concept. Aaron has a question whether there are any preliminary cost comparisons between the different alternatives. And we will be getting into that in the criteria section, which we'll get to in just a couple of minutes. But I wondered if Dave wanted to just share a little bit about the project budget, since we didn't have an update on that. There isn't an update, but just to kind of talk about what the budget is and where it comes from.
Oh, you put me on the spot here. Well, it's in most of our lives, with a few exceptions out there, budget's pretty important in any decision we make. And so the budget that's been assigned to this program by the legislature is just shy of $94 million. It's very important for us to look at that cost. And as we look at all of these different alternatives, that number is divided includes design, our design effort, which is, let's just say it's around $10 million. And then there's about $60 million for the actual construction itself, the cost of materials, labor, mobilization, construction administration, and all that. And then the balance of the 94 is in what we call risk. And so there's money's there to deal with things that could change over the life of the design, including material escalations, for example, or other risks that present themselves along the process. So that's kind of how the budget's broken down. And whether you're buying a car or you're building the ferry terminal, it's an important part of what we have available. So it plays into some of the, some of the options and plays into, for example, the last comment was about the size of the dock. If we widen the dock, there's a different cost, not only to the environment than if we lengthen it, but there's also a different cost in the construction of a wider dock versus if we have to move all of the berthing facilities, the wing walls and dolphins and all that. If we have to move that further offshore, there's a cost associated with that. So that's one of our screening criteria is the capital costs of this project, and we're taking that into account. It's something that the community advisory group has been trying to dig into a little bit more, but like Marcia said, we're still in this sort of conceptual phase. And so we haven't provided that level of detail in terms of what does it cost to build a new ferry terminal at a brand new location, like somebody proposed, what if you move the Vashon ferry terminal? Well, there's a significant cost associated with that. And those costs are well in excess of the 94 million. So we haven't gotten into that level of detail, but I think I just want to introduce that is part of our screening process. Is that what you wanted, Lauren?
That's great. Thank you so
Okay.
much. I just realized that we had talked about that with the KEG and wanted to make sure that we brought that into this meeting as well. I appreciate
Okay.
that. Let's see, Laura Arbor.
Yeah, hi everyone. Laura Arbor, State Fish and Wildlife. I just wanted to tag on to what Penny Kelly was saying, and just for the record, pointing out that, of course, as you guys are probably well aware, each alternative has a suite of environmental impacts and benefits that would need to be evaluated. We've got forage fish spawning at the existing facility, so there's surf smelt and sand lance along much of that shoreline. You've got eelgrass concerns, and of course, you've got Fauntleroy Creek and salmon. So also additional impacts may require compensatory mitigation depending on, how everything pencils out. So just things to keep in mind also this early stage. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that and making sure that it's on the record here. Allison O'Sullivan.
I just got done typing it into.
Go ahead. Why don't you read it?
I could get a copy of the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I had to join late due to a conflict. I'm not sure about all of the alternatives, but any that require additional overwater coverage may not be acceptable to the Suquamish tribe.
And Allison, I'm forwarding you the materials right now, so you'll see them come up.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us when you could. So that's super important for us to hear, and thank you for sharing. Marcia,
I know
the
tribe has opposed private mooring buoys in this area, so they do take these structures seriously. So I just wanted to let you know up front that could be a problem.
Thank you so much. Marcia, did you want to respond to that at all?
Sure. Thanks, Allison, for the question. I want to remind that at this point, this is the initial stage of alternative development, and they are really based on the program that's outlined in the purpose and needs statement. So it really is that 50,000 or 100,000 foot level view of where could this program be implemented, and as a means to get to a reasonable range of alternatives once we get through all of the screening. So some of these alternatives, and even as Mark has mentioned and others in this meeting, that they are also representative of what we'd heard from the community. And so we appreciate the expertise that all of you who represent agencies and tribes bring to the table to help us temper these alternatives to and also understand where refinements are possible and not possible. So I hope that helps in explaining back where we are and why they may somehow, in some ways, seem to not consider all of the fine aspects of a location.
Thank you. David Fort is referring to alternative F, asking what would be the southbound couplet if Fauntleroy Way is one way north? Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll say that we haven't obviously taken that next step of even advancing that, David, in terms of looking into that yet. I mean, I'll be honest, it seems like this is not the most of it has some effects of doing this, and so therefore it's perhaps not going to be one of the more viable options to proceed forward. You know, knowing the area there a little bit, basically the only street that comes to mind is to use 35th, which is the next street that's, you know, further east that kind of basically connects to the similar fashion as Fauntleroy. But obviously this has a lot of implications in terms of the traffic patterns and how people access the park, access their houses, access the ferry terminal, etc. So.
Okay. Thank you. Laura, is your hand up from earlier, or do you have another question? Aha.
Sorry.
That's all right. All right, so it looks like we're getting close to moving into the screening criteria discussion, and I'll pass it over to Marcia. But before we do, I just want to check in, are there any alternatives that it feels like are missing from this range that we should be sure to send through this first level of screening? Anything that's not represented here in some configuration of these alternatives? All right. If something comes to you, put it in the chat or raise your hand and we can circle back to that. All right, next I'm gonna pass it over to Marcia to run through the screening criteria that we're looking at and some of the adjustments that we are making to our screening approach based on feedback we've received.
Thanks, Lauren. Well, the main information, second part of the main information we want to convey today has to do with the screening criteria that we're going to be using to evaluate all of these alternatives, and to say that these are intended to make sure that we are only caring for the alternatives that will meet the project's purpose and need and would represent a reasonable range of alternatives. We recently revised the screening criteria that after having response from our CAG meetings, and to hope that they better define safety, budget, operational efficiencies, schedule, level of coordination with partnering agencies, and the amount of new right-of-way that would be required, and impacts to levels of service, and impacts to the neighboring neighborhood streets. So we welcome your feedback on this criteria today, and even after the meeting, as you get to think about it more. This is all really still at a high level of screening, but the aim is that it would provide some useful information moving into the next more detailed round for level 2 of alternatives, refinement, and screening. So on this, you'll see the list of criteria that we've developed to date, and I'll just run through those. We would be using the basic matrix format where that we rate the alternatives from a 1 to 5, with 5 being the high score and 1 being low. So that, and they would be represented using balls. I'm told that ball symbol is called the Harvey ball, and it's shaded accordingly to mark out 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Where a blank ball would be 1, and a full shaded ball would be a high score 5. And by using the matrix system, we're able to see how those alternatives stack up against each one, and how they measure against existing conditions, or really what we have today. And so in a nutshell, they'll be able to show us how well an alternative responds to the criteria for each question, And so this type of graphic, as many of you are well aware, provides a quick way to summarize which of the alternatives appear to best meet the initial feasibility screening and those that do not meet it. So the list of questions here are, an ability to meet requirements for structural reliability, an ability to accommodate projected sea level rise, which is resilience, an ability to improve operational efficiencies, which would mean minimizing dwell time and process vehicles more efficiently and maintain on-time performance, safety, how well the alternative reduces the number of conflict points between traffic modes like vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians, an ability to meet demand projected in our 2040 long-range plan, an ability to meet operational requirements, which is the ability to accommodate 180 on the dock or in upland holding, and to access an Issaquah class vessel, connection to minor arterial. Then level of service, an ability to meet current sailing schedules, which is the number of peak departures and crossing time, an ability to enhance multimodal connections and or allow for growth in walk-ons, bicycles, and van pools. And then project cost, which is design, planning, purchase of right-of-way, and risk within the project, and construction, how those all align with funding. Timeline, alignment with current project schedule, and then project feasibility, the amount of additional right-of-way that's needed beyond the existing terminal footprint, and then also including permitting and policy risk of project delays, which is really the level of coordination with external partners, permitting complexity, and policy framework. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Marcia. I know it's always fun to read a list word for word on a PowerPoint slide, but this is the one material that we didn't get to you ahead of time, so I wanted to make sure that you were able to absorb it before giving feedback. So do take your time looking through this, but we'd like to know what questions you have about our approach to this process, and specifically if this gets to the level of detail that your agency would like to see in our first level of screening of these alternatives that we showed you. So Benjamin is saying in the chat, he's seeing a gap in screening criteria that measure impacts to the surrounding transportation system. For example, changes to operations, amount of loading, and curbside use of existing streets. So you're saying there's a gap, there isn't criteria to measure the impacts of surrounding transportation system. Is that right, Benjamin?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm seeing, that it's something that's a little more discrete than permitting risk. It's a little more than operational requirements, just kind of, yeah, those impacts off the facility. Obviously, some of these alternatives have changes to the operations of Fauntleroy Way, various amounts of access and loading on Fauntleroy Way. I think even for the alternatives that are at the park locations, the Lincoln Park or the Loman Beach Park, are these fully self-contained 186 vehicle facilities, but what will the impacts to the traffic in and out be? So I think at a high level, just are there major, minor, no impacts to the transportation system?
Thanks. Marcia, do you want to respond to that at all?
Well, I might need but maybe that our traffic guy Mark can also assist with it. But yeah, we really looked at just the footprint of the existing facility in relationship to the alternative, and then this last bullet, looking at permitting and policy risk. That's kind of an area where we're seeing that coordination with external partners about really what's happening, and that's what you're talking about is how these alternatives measure up with what's going to need to change for the external traffic conditions. But I'd like to see if Mark has more information to add.
I'm unmuted. Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to add that, Ben, it's a good point to call out. I think our intent was that that's capturing somewhere. Some of that is in the multimodal connections aspect, but I think you bring up a good point of like the sort of the curb space management and circulation aspects. So we have it captured in a couple, but I think we can think about how to more discreetly, as you said, identify that either within one of these topics or separately.
Thanks. And just a reminder that this is the first phase of screening, and there is a more detailed analysis that would get, refine the alternatives to a point where that's easier to get into a more detailed answer to that. But this is pulling forward more of the criteria that community members said they wanted to see. So this is, there are opportunities to look at that in this first round. Thank you. Penny, go ahead.
Okay, so there was something that somebody said earlier about like the electric stuff and saying, well, then you would need faster charging times, or, just kind of looking at this whole thing from an engineering perspective. So I was kind of wondering about if the first two screening criteria is where that would kind of be looked at, because I'm used to seeing structural reliability be like, will the terminal fall down in an earthquake or not? So seismic concerns, and then this is also like the life of a structure and the maintenance that has to be performed. So that's what I'm used to structural reliability kind of meaning to me, at least when I've seen it. But that's like also it pops up then in when you're working with Washington State Ferries as they're using the facility and they have to do maintenance. So the structural reliability, I wasn't sure if that would account for it, or the resilience, but how do you guys also, how do people, I should say, accommodate or screen these alternatives for the engineering perspectives of adjusting a terminal to meet technology changes and changes in the ferry systems, which I've seen at the maintenance facility recently. They're like, we got to have a way to, like, new ferries come on board with new ways of operating. And so the way they even have to access them required them to go in and make changes. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm hoping that makes sense to an engineer.
Well, I'm certainly not an engineer, but I do think I'm hearing two questions. Sort of, one is, where is the criteria of kind of forward compatibility with emerging technology? Where is that captured in this? And also, what is the criteria within structural reliability and resilience? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That sounds good, Lauren. Thanks.
Cool. Marcia, do you want to start us off with that?
Sure. Well, the structural reliability really is being able to meet our design standards as outlined in our terminal design manual. So that is the lifespan of 75 years, and building and making adjustments to the new terminal design so that it meets current building codes as required, and just bringing up the overall functionality of the structure. And the reliance part, as you see here, is really making sure that it's resilient against the sea level rise as it's spelled out. And then we would have to design it so that it can accommodate or not preclude any future use or changes according to electrification, which is part of the long range plan. And there's a larger project that I think Dave is better to explain that for our terminal system, where electrification infrastructure would be in place, be implemented later on. So this, whatever the new facility at Fauntleroy would be built to accommodate that.
Thanks. Dave, do you have anything to add there?
Not much, just to reiterate kind of what Marcia was getting at. I mean, it could be a screening criteria that we add in here as a standalone item, that, you know, the ability to accommodate future vessel charging. I also kind of like how Marcia answered it, which kind of fit that underneath the structural reliability. It is a structural issue as it pertains to, do we have the space on the dock to accommodate a charging station and switch gear and meters and all the infrastructure we need. So it's certainly something that Penny, we haven't forgotten about. It just didn't find its way on this list, but I don't see why we couldn't put that on here. It will be a requirement no matter where the terminal ends up.
Thank you. Now, there's a couple of comments in the chat related to criteria associated with park impacts in the criteria, and I wonder if that is captured in that last piece, the permitting and policy risk, but I want to check in with Marcia about that.
Yeah, on a broad scale, that's what that one is about, is would an alternative based on its location and the resources within its environs, or that would it impact them in a way that would require some additional partnership and coordination with other agencies in order to meet different approvals? And is that of a magnitude that's not feasible or feasible within the timeline and budget of the project?
Okay.
Lauren, can I just weigh in on that? It sounds
Sure.
like we're hearing a few comments from Chris and David and others that we should consider a separate criteria for section 4F or impacts to parks, which I think is a really good suggestion and something that we did sort of discuss a little bit at a time, but I think that's good feedback. And it's something that the CAG also has brought up to us several times.
Okay. Thank you. Jacob?
Hi there, this is Jacob Brett from King County Metro. I think one reference I don't directly see called out in the criteria is public transportation. Would love to see a little call out in there. And I think something Chris mentioned earlier in the chat was sort of bus stop infrastructure as well. I think at least one of the alternatives would affect some of the bus stop infrastructure we have planned for our rapid ride program. So would just be great to see a specific call out in there, probably somewhere in the enhancing multimodal connections item, but I realize this is probably not the exact language that would be used in any sort of scorecard.
Thank you. So it sounds like having an explicit mention of transit as part of that consideration. Very helpful. Jerry?
Thanks. Sorry about the mute delay. I was listening to Ben Smith's conversation about landside access and wondered if this is perhaps covered under permitting or where you would put issues around navigational impacts, just the difference between the Lohman dock and the existing. It seems like one alternative is Lohman dock, the others use the existing terminal, but are there differences in navigational impacts or other waterside impacts?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So maybe calling that out specifically, it sounds like would be helpful.
If it's a distinguisher, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I believe our engineers, when they were looking at these alternatives, chose those spots that seem to be able to provide navigational access. So we might need to check in more with them on if there's ways to distinguish between each of the alternatives and whether there are other parameters for understanding that access.
Jerry, are you referring to access for the ferries or impacts to navigational impacts, like for shipping lanes and to other maritime uses? Speaking.
I think both. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for calling that out.
I think you missed our discussion at the beginning that this is very related to some of the alternate locations that have been suggested by the community, one of which is up in Elliott Bay or moving the terminal dramatically away from Fauntleroy. And that's certainly a consideration for those locations too.
Yeah. Okay. I hope to follow up with you later.
Yeah.
Here, I missed that. Thank you.
Okay. It's a good comment, and your Port of Seattle hat is very helpful on that.
All right. Looks like the questions are slowing down. So I will ask, if now that you've seen these criteria, are there any other questions that you want to circle back to related to the alternatives? And is just generally, does this seem like a reasonable approach to narrow down our set of alternatives going into the next round of screening? I guess I'll just ask maybe for kind of a gut check in the chat box. Would you feel comfortable moving forward with this set of criteria for our level 1 screening? You can just say yes, no, or unsure.
Lauren, when you say that, are you meaning with the addition of some of the suggestions we just heard?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you so much. Yes.
Just to clarify.
With the additions that we just heard related to transit and navigation and kind of parks, permitting, environmental. Thank you. All right. All right, well, we're a little early here. I'll just ask the project team, is there anything else you feel like you would like to ask TAG members while we have this group assembled? This has been super helpful, really great feedback. Excited about moving forward and bringing some of this information back to you.
Yeah, this is Marsha Tolan. I was wondering if Sharon Love, if you have any feedback about how you see this working in the Pell process, that this level or approach is going to take us to where we want to be in the overall process.
Yeah, I think so. It's making a lot of sense to me. So I think you're on the right track.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Well, then we can move into wrapping it up and talking about next steps. Oh, Allison asks if WDFW is okay with moving forward. Laura, do you, how are you feeling about this approach?
Yeah, in addition to my comments earlier, Allison, I think, signed on right about the time that I was just finishing up sharing my comments, that, yeah, I think so.
Great, thank you. And we will take all of this feedback and refine this set of criteria and make sure that your feedback is incorporated into our approach and follow up accordingly. All right. Well, we really appreciate the time and attention this afternoon. And of course, if you dig into these materials anymore after we sign off and have comments or thoughts or questions that you want to share, be sure to send them along to our project inbox. And we are next going to update the alternatives and the screening criteria with your feedback, as I said, and we're going to conduct the screening process and then in the next few weeks and bring those results back to you and the executive advisory group and the community advisory group to get the information that everyone has asked for so that we can move forward with a refined set of alternatives. And we're also planning for community meetings later this spring, and we'll be in touch soon as we schedule those. So we hope that you can help us get the word out through your project email updates and other channels that you have. So we'll follow up soon on that. And are there any final questions about what we shared in this meeting or what's coming next? What to expect from us? All right. Well, I always enjoy letting people out of a meeting early. So I will just say thank you again. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and get out there in the sun. You now have 27 unaccounted for minutes to take a walk or stroll. But yeah, don't hesitate to reach out and we'll look forward to catching up with you once we have some more information to share.
When is the policy meeting?
Sorry, can you say that again?
When is the policy? Oh, sorry.
The executive advisory group meeting, is that the one that Chairman Forsman sits on? Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Allison? Yeah, so we have not scheduled it yet. As Lauren was mentioning, that's the EAG that she just mentioned. We will be meeting with them when we have the results of the level one screening. So filling in the matrix that Marcia was discussing and have sort of a first cut of that and getting feedback on how that screening comes out. So we'll be scheduling that meeting when we know when we'll have those results. So probably the next, in May, I would guess at this point.
Might not be a bad
May.
idea. Might not be a bad idea to get something on the calendar. I know with Chairman
Yes.
Forsman, we've got to schedule that way out.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so now that we're at this point and we've sort of recalibrated our screening I think you came in after we talked about, we heard some feedback from our community advisory group that led us to sort of change our process a bit. So now that we've done that, you're right. We need to get that scheduled and we need to schedule the next several meetings for your group, this group, and the executive advisory group and community advisory group. It's a good comment to do that early.
All right. I think that's it from us. Anybody else want to have the last word?
Thanks everybody for coming. Really appreciate your time and effort to be here, and great discussion. And we really appreciate it. It's an important part of the process to move this project along. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.